The ancient Scottish wind carried whispers of change through Edinburgh's cobblestone streets on that crisp morning in July 2023. For 70 long years, Scotland had waited for this moment. Not just the crowning of a new monarch, but the return of a king who truly understood the Scottish heart. Charles Philip Arthur George, now King Charles III, was about to make history in the land of his grandmother's deepest affections. Unlike the grand spectacle in London months earlier, this ceremony promised something different, something more intimate, more meaningful. This wasn't just about crowns and scepters. It was about healing old wounds, honoring ancient traditions, and bridging the gap between a modern monarchy and a proud nation that had sometimes felt forgotten. As the first rays of sunlight touched the spires of St. Giles Cathedral, few could have imagined the emotional journey that was about to unfold. The man who had waited longer than any heir in British history to wear the crown was about to discover that becoming king in Scotland meant something entirely different than ruling from London's golden throne. This is the story of how a nation welcomed its king, how a king found his true calling, and how one historic day changed the relationship between Scotland and the crown forever. It's a tale of tradition meeting modernity, of personal transformation, and of the quiet power that comes when a monarch stops trying to rule and starts learning to serve. The morning mist clung to Edinburgh's ancient stones like a protective veil as Charles stepped from his car outside Holyrood House Palace. He paused for a moment, breathing in the crisp Scottish air that had welcomed generations of his family before him. This wasn't his first visit to Scotland as king, but it felt different somehow. Today, he wasn't just visiting, he was coming home. The previous months had been a whirlwind of ceremonies, state functions, and the overwhelming weight of a crown that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. London's grandeur had impressed the world during his coronation, but Charles knew that winning over Scotland would require something far more precious than pageantry. It would require his heart. Margaret Stewart, a local historian who had spent decades studying royal visits to Scotland, stood among the early morning crowd gathering along the Royal Mile. She remembered the nervous energy that had surrounded previous royal visits, the careful choreography designed to minimize any potential for protest or embarrassment. But today felt different. The conversations she overheard weren't filled with the usual grumbling about English royalty or debates about independence. Instead, there was curiosity, even cautious optimism. "My grandmother always said Charles was different," she murmured to her companion, adjusting her tartan scarf against the cool breeze. She met him when he was just a young man, visiting Highland communities. Said he actually listened when people talked, not like he was waiting for his turn to speak. Inside Holyrood House, Charles stood before the mirror in the same room where his mother had prepared for countless Scottish engagements. The reflection looking back at him showed a man who had aged considerably in the months since becoming king. The weight of the crown wasn't just ceremonial. It was emotional, spiritual, and deeply personal. But as he adjusted his kilt, a gift from a Highland regiment, he felt something he hadn't experienced in London's grand palaces. He felt like himself. His private secretary, James Morrison, entered quietly with the day's final schedule adjustments. Morrison had served the royal family for over 2 decades and had never seen Charles appear so calm before a major public event. Usually, there were last-minute concerns, requests for changes, or nervous energy that filled the room. Today, Charles seemed almost meditative. "The crowds are already gathering at St. Giles," Morrison reported. "Security estimates suggest we might see over 50,000 people along the route. That's significantly more than initially projected." Charles nodded, but his attention seemed focused elsewhere. He walked to the window overlooking the gardens where his mother had once planted a tree to commemorate her silver jubilee. The tree had grown strong and tall, its branches now providing shade for visitors who came to walk the same paths that Scottish royalty had traveled for centuries. "James," Charles said quietly, "I want to make an unscheduled stop." Morrison's face showed polite concern. Unscheduled stops were security nightmares and protocol disasters. "Sir, the timing is quite tight, and we've already confirmed the route with, "There's a care home on Canongate," Charles interrupted gently. "Rosemary House. I've been corresponding with one of the residents, an elderly lady named Agnes MacLeod. She's 97 and wrote to me about her late husband's service in the Highland Regiment. I'd like to see her." Morrison quickly calculated the implications. The route would need adjusting, security would need briefing, and the cathedral would need to be informed of a delay. But something in Charles's voice suggested this wasn't a request. It was a quiet command from a king who had finally found his own way of ruling. Meanwhile, at Rosemary House, Agnes MacLeod sat in her favorite chair by the window, watching the early morning preparations in the street below. Her granddaughter, Sarah, had brought fresh flowers to brighten her room, not knowing about the correspondence between Agnes and the king. Agnes had written to Charles 3 months earlier, sharing memories of her husband's military service and her own 60-year career as a primary school teacher in Edinburgh's Old Town. To her amazement, Charles had written back personally, not through a secretary or with a formal acknowledgement, but with a handwritten letter that showed he had read every word of her original message. He had asked thoughtful questions about her teaching experiences and her husband's stories from his time in the Highlands. The exchange had continued through several letters, creating an unlikely friendship between a nonagenarian former teacher and the King of the United Kingdom. Agnes had mentioned in her most recent letter that she would be watching the ceremony from her window, as her mobility made it impossible to join the crowds. She had written about feeling disconnected from modern Scotland, about watching the world change, while feeling increasingly invisible in her advanced age. Charles's letters had made her feel seen again, valued for her experiences, and wisdom rather than dismissed because of her age. The young residents at the care home buzzed with excitement as news spread that the king might be coming. Staff members scrambled to ensure everything was presentable, though the facility's warm, homey atmosphere needed no artificial enhancement. Rosemary House had always prided itself on being a genuine community rather than an institutional care facility. Back at Holyrood House, Charles made his way to the drawing room where a small gathering of Scottish dignitaries awaited his presence. Among them was Fiona Mackenzie, the Lord Provost of Edinburgh, a woman whose own journey from a working-class background to civic leadership embodied the changing face of Scottish society. She had been skeptical about the monarchy's relevance to modern Scotland, but had found herself impressed by Charles's genuine interest in social issues during their previous meetings. "Your Majesty," she greeted him warmly, "Edinburgh is honored to host this historic ceremony." Charles studied her face, recognizing the sincerity beneath the formal words. "Lord Provost, I must confess that I feel more honored than Edinburgh should. This city has shaped so much of who I am, even when I was too young to understand it fully." The conversation that followed revealed Charles's deep knowledge of Edinburgh's history, but more importantly, his understanding of its current challenges. He spoke knowledgeably about housing issues in the city, about the struggles facing local businesses, and about the environmental initiatives that Edinburgh had pioneered. This wasn't prepared briefing material being recited. It was genuine engagement from a man who had clearly spent time learning about the real Scotland, not just its tourist attractions. Dr. Robert Hamilton, a professor of Scottish history at the University of Edinburgh, found himself genuinely surprised by the depth of Charles's understanding. He had attended royal visits before where the conversations felt rehearsed and superficial. Today was different. Charles asked questions that showed real comprehension of complex issues and offered insights that could only come from someone who had spent considerable time thinking about Scotland's place in the modern world. As the time approached to depart for St. Giles Cathedral, Charles felt a familiar flutter of nervous energy. But it wasn't the anxiety he had experienced before other royal engagements. This felt more like the anticipation an actor might feel before a performance he had spent years preparing for, not through rehearsal, but through living, learning, and growing into the role naturally. The streets of Edinburgh's Old Town had begun filling with people hours before the scheduled ceremony. Unlike the carefully managed crowds at London events, this gathering felt organic, spontaneous. There were families with children, elderly couples sharing folding chairs, university students with homemade banners, and visitors from around Scotland who had traveled specifically for this moment. Mary Campbell, a retired nurse from Glasgow, had taken the early train to Edinburgh with her sister. They found spots along the high street where they could see both the procession route and the cathedral entrance. Mary had been somewhat skeptical about the monarchy throughout her life, viewing it as an expensive anachronism in modern Britain. But something about this particular ceremony had drawn her to make the journey. "I keep thinking about his mum," she confided to her sister as they waited. "How she always seemed to understand Scotland, you know? Not like she was visiting a foreign country within her own kingdom. Maybe he's got a bit of that in him, too." Her sister, Jean, nodded thoughtfully. Jean had been a teacher for 40 years and had always been fascinated by the ways people grew into their roles. She had watched shy children become confident leaders and seen natural leaders learn humility through experience. Charles's journey to the throne had been longer than most, and she wondered if that extended preparation might have created a different kind of king. The sound of bagpipes in the distance signaled that the ceremony was approaching. The music seemed to rise from the stones themselves, ancient melodies that had accompanied Scottish gatherings for generations. The crowd's energy shifted subtly, not to the formal attention expected at state occasions, but to something warmer, more familial. As Charles's procession began its journey from Holyrood House towards St. Giles, he could see faces in the crowd that reminded him why this day mattered so much. These weren't subjects gathering to witness royal pageantry. They were neighbors welcoming someone they hoped would understand their hopes, their challenges, and their dreams for Scotland's future. The first part of his Scottish journey as king was about to begin, but Charles sensed that the real journey, the one that would define his relationship with Scotland, had started long before this morning and would continue long after today's ceremonies ended. In the faces along the Royal Mile, he saw not just respect for the crown, but cautious hope for the man who wore it. The black Bentley moved slowly through Edinburgh's ancient streets, but for Charles, time seemed suspended. Through the bulletproof windows, he could see the faces of people who had chosen to spend their day witnessing this moment in history. What struck him most wasn't their formal respect, but their genuine curiosity. Children waved Scottish flags alongside Union Jacks. Teenagers held up phones to capture the moment, and elderly residents leaned on walking sticks to get a better view. James Morrison sat across from Charles, tablet in hand, ready to provide any last-minute information. But the king seemed lost in thought, his gaze moving from face to face in the crowd. Morrison had attended dozens of royal engagements, but he had never seen Charles appear so completely present, so engaged with the moment rather than focused on the next item in the schedule. "Sir, we're approaching Canongate," Morrison said quietly. "Would you still like to make that stop at Rosemary House?" Charles turned from the window, and Morrison saw something in his expression that he had never seen before, a quiet determination that seemed to come from deep within. "Yes, James. Some things are more important than keeping to schedule." The security detail received word of the unscheduled stop with professional calm, though privately they scrambled to adjust their positions. Detective Inspector Sarah Ross, who had coordinated royal security in Scotland for over a decade, quickly radioed ahead to ensure the care home staff were prepared. She had learned to expect the unexpected with this particular royal visit. Charles seemed determined to do things his own way. At Rosemary House, Agnes MacLeod had given up trying to see the procession from her window. The crowds had grown too thick, and at her age, standing for long periods left her dizzy. She had settled back in her chair with a cup of tea and her latest book when the care home's manager, David Thompson, appeared in her doorway with an expression of barely controlled excitement. "Agnes," he said, his voice slightly breathless, "you need to come to the front lounge. Right now." "What's all the fuss about, David? I can hear the bagpipes from here. The ceremony will be lovely, I'm sure." "Agnes," David repeated, kneeling beside her chair, "His Majesty is here. He's asking for you specifically." Agnes stared at him in confusion. "That's not possible, dear. You must have misunderstood something." But Even as she spoke, she could hear the commotion in the hallway, voices she didn't recognize, the sound of efficient movement, and underneath it all, the familiar voice she had only heard on television, but somehow knew intimately from their correspondence. David helped her to her feet and walked with her toward the front of the building. Agnes's hands shook slightly as they made their way through the corridor, past residents and staff who had gathered to witness something none of them had ever expected to see. In the front lounge, Charles stood near the large windows, his height and bearing unmistakable even in the modest surroundings of the care home. He had removed his ceremonial hat and was speaking quietly with two residents who had introduced themselves. When he saw Agnes approaching with David's assistance, his face lit up with genuine warmth. "Mrs. McLeod," he said, stepping forward with his hand extended, "it's such a pleasure to finally meet you in person." Agnes stopped, staring at this man who had taken time from one of the most important days of his reign to visit a care home because of letters they had exchanged. Her mind struggled to process the reality of the moment. "Your Majesty, I can't believe you're really here. Your letters have meant more to me than you know," Charles said gently, taking her hand between both of his. "When you wrote about feeling invisible, I realized that's exactly what I never want anyone in Scotland to feel. Not while I'm king." Agnes felt tears forming in her eyes. In her 97 years, she had met local politicians, church leaders, and community figures. But no one had ever made her feel as valued, as truly seen, as this man who could have been anywhere in the world, but had chosen to spend precious time with her. "I brought you something," Charles continued, reaching into his jacket. He produced a small, wrapped package. "It's nothing elaborate, but I thought you might appreciate it." With trembling fingers, Agnes unwrapped the gift to find a leather-bound journal with her initials embossed on the cover. Inside the front cover, Charles had written a personal inscription for Agnes MacLeod, whose wisdom and stories deserve to be preserved for future generations. "Thank you for reminding me what truly matters. With deepest respect and friendship, Charles R. Your Majesty," Agnes whispered, clutching the journal. "I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," Charles replied softly. "But if you're willing, I hope you'll keep writing. Your perspectives on how Scotland has changed, your memories of teaching generations of Edinburgh children. These stories are part of our national treasure." Around them, the other residents and staff watched in amazement. This wasn't a photo opportunity or a ceremonial visit. This was a genuine moment of human connection between two people who had found friendship through simple, honest communication. Margaret Stewart, the local historian, had somehow learned about the unscheduled stop and managed to position herself across the street. Through the large windows of Rosemary House, she could see Charles in animated conversation with several elderly residents. What struck her most was his body language. He wasn't standing formally or looking around for his exit strategy. He was sitting in a regular chair, leaning forward, clearly listening intently to whatever Agnes MacLeod was telling him. 30 years I've been watching royal visits," she murmured to herself, "and I've never seen anything like this." Inside the care home, Charles had indeed settled into a chair beside Agnes, seemingly oblivious to the scheduled pressures building outside. Agnes was telling him about her late husband's stories from his Highland Regiment service, and Charles was asking detailed questions that showed both knowledge and genuine interest. "Tommy used to say the hardest part wasn't the physical challenges," Agnes was explaining. "It was being so far from home, from the places and people that made you who you were." He said the landscape up there was beautiful but foreign, and he had to learn to find pieces of home in it. Charles nodded thoughtfully. "I think I understand that feeling better now than I ever have before. The throne can feel like foreign territory sometimes, even when you've been preparing for it your whole life. You have to find ways to make it feel like home, don't you?" Agnes studied his face, seeing something in his expression that reminded her of the young soldiers her husband had described. Men trying to find their footing in unfamiliar territory. Tommy always said the secret was remembering that the landscape doesn't define you. You define how you move through it. The wisdom in her words settled over Charles like a comfortable blanket. Here was a woman who had lived through nearly a century of change, who had taught thousands of children, who had loved deeply and lost, and continued to find joy in simple moments. Her perspective was exactly what he needed to hear, not as king, but as a human being trying to navigate unprecedented circumstances. Morrison appeared quietly at Charles's shoulder, tapping his watch discreetly. The cathedral was expecting them, and delays at this level required notifications that rippled through multiple layers of protocol. But Charles seemed reluctant to leave this conversation, this moment of genuine connection. "Agnes," he said finally, "I'm afraid I must continue to the cathedral. But I want you to know that talking with you today has helped me more than any briefing or ceremony could. Will you promise me something?" "Of course, Your Majesty. Promise me you'll use that journal. Your stories matter, your observations about how Scotland has changed and grown. These perspectives help people like me understand what really matters. And promise me you'll write to me again. Our correspondence has become one of the most meaningful parts of my role as king." Agnes nodded, still clutching the journal. "I promise. And Your Majesty, thank you for seeing me. Really seeing me. At my age, that's rarer than you might think." Charles stood and took her hand one final time. "Thank you for reminding me what I'm really here to do." As Charles prepared to leave Rosemary House, word of his unscheduled stop had spread through the crowd along the Royal Mile. The response wasn't criticism about delays or protocol breaches. Instead, people seemed impressed that their new king had chosen to visit elderly residents rather than rushing to the formal ceremony. Tom Mackenzie, a retired Edinburgh police officer who had worked crowd control for previous royal visits, found himself genuinely moved by what he was witnessing. "In 40 years of police work, I've seen a lot of VIPs who talk about caring about people," he told his wife over the phone. "This is the first time I've seen one actually prove it when nobody was watching." The truth was, of course, that everyone was watching. But Charles seemed to have forgotten about the cameras, the schedules, and the expectations. He was simply being himself, a man who understood that kingship meant service, not ceremony. As his car pulled away from Rosemary House, Charles waved one final time to Agnes, who had been helped to the front window, to see him off. The image of the elderly woman waving from behind the glass, clutching her new journal, would later be described by photographers as one of the most moving moments of the entire day. The procession continued towards St. Giles Cathedral, but something had fundamentally changed. Charles carried with him not just the formal responsibilities of his role, but the personal conviction that he was exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. Scotland was beginning to feel less like a kingdom to be managed and more like a community to be served. The ancient stones of St. Giles Cathedral had witnessed 8 centuries of Scottish history, but the building seemed to hold its breath as Charles approached. The Gothic spires reached toward gray Scottish skies that had cleared just enough to allow filtered sunlight through the stained glass windows. Inside, representatives from every corner of Scottish society waited in pews that had accommodated everyone from Mary Queen of Scots to John Knox. The ceremony planned for today was deliberately different from the grandiose coronation in London's Westminster Abbey. This was intended to be more intimate, more distinctly Scottish, and more focused on the relationship between the crown and the Scottish people rather than the international symbolism of monarchy. Charles had specifically requested that the service emphasize service over sovereignty, community over ceremony. Dr. Ian Torrance, the former moderator of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland, stood at the altar reviewing his notes one final time. He had worked closely with Charles for months to design a service that would honor Scottish traditions while speaking to contemporary values. The king had been remarkably hands-on in the planning, asking thoughtful questions about Scottish theological traditions and expressing particular interest in the concept of servant leadership that had deep roots in Presbyterian thought. "He's not like other royals I've worked with, Dr. Torrance confided to his assistant earlier that morning. He asked questions that suggest he's actually wrestling with what it means to serve Scotland, not just rule it. That's a profound difference." In the pews, The congregation represented a careful balance of tradition and progress. Highland clan chiefs sat alongside community activists. Business leaders shared space with charity workers. University students were seated near retired coal miners. This wasn't just Scotland's establishment gathering to witness royal ceremony. This was Scotland itself, in all its complexity and diversity. Among the congregation was Dr. Morag McInnes, a general practitioner from the Isle of Skye who had been chosen to represent rural healthcare workers. She had been skeptical about attending, viewing the invitation as tokenism rather than genuine engagement. But her conversation with Charles during a pre-ceremony reception had changed her perspective entirely. Charles had asked detailed questions about healthcare challenges in remote Scottish communities, demonstrating knowledge that could only have come from serious research. When she mentioned the difficulty of recruiting specialists to work in the Highlands, he had immediately referenced a conversation he'd had with medical students in Aberdeen about exactly that issue. He hadn't just been making polite conversation. He had been gathering information, building understanding, preparing to be a more effective advocate for Scottish interests. "I came here expecting platitudes about rural Scotland," Dr. McInnes later told her colleague. "Instead, I met someone who understood our challenges better than most politicians who represent us in Parliament." The cathedral doors opened, and the sound of Highland bagpipes filled the ancient space. The music was hauntingly beautiful, a lament that seemed to acknowledge both the weight of history and the hope for the future. As Charles entered, walking slowly behind the processional cross, the congregation rose not with the mechanical response of formal protocol, but with something that felt more like respect mixed with curiosity. Charles had chosen to wear the kilt of the royal Stuart tartan, but he had asked that the ceremony avoid excessive military pageantry. Instead of a formal military escort, he was accompanied by representatives from Scottish charities, community organizations, and youth groups. This processional told a story about the Scotland he wanted to serve, not just its ancient traditions, but its living, working, striving present. As he walked down the aisle, Charles's eyes moved across the faces in the congregation. He recognized many of them from previous visits, but he saw them differently now. They weren't just Scottish subjects. They were partners in the work of building a better Scotland. The responsibility felt enormous, but for the first time since becoming king, it also felt manageable because it was shared. The service began with a traditional Gaelic blessing, sung by the renowned Scottish Gaelic singer Julie Fowlis. Her voice filled the cathedral with ancient words that spoke of protection, guidance, and community. For many in the congregation, hearing their ancestral language honored in such a formal setting brought unexpected emotion. Scotland's cultural identity had sometimes felt marginalized in royal ceremonies. Today, it was centered and celebrated. Dr. Torrance's opening words set the tone for everything that followed. "We gather today not to crown a ruler, but to witness a covenant, a sacred promise between a servant and the people he serves." King Charles comes to Scotland not as a stranger, but as someone who has spent decades learning what it means to care for Scottish communities. Charles had requested that the service include time for him to speak directly to the Scottish people, without the formal language of prepared speeches. When the moment came, he rose and stepped forward, leaving his prepared notes behind. "My friends," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the cathedral's perfect acoustics, "I stand before you today not because of any inherent right to rule, but because I hope to earn the privilege of serving Scotland and her people." The words were simple, but their impact was immediate. This wasn't the language of monarchy as traditionally understood. This was the language of someone asking for permission to help, not demanding obedience or respect. Scotland has taught me that leadership means listening more than speaking, learning more than teaching, and serving more than commanding. In the communities I've visited across this great nation, I've seen ordinary people doing extraordinary things, caring for neighbors, protecting the environment, building businesses, raising families, creating art, pursuing knowledge, and working every day to make Scotland a better place for everyone who calls it home. In the congregation, people leaned forward, drawn by the personal tone of his words. This wasn't a speech about the glories of monarchy or the traditions of the crown. This was one person talking to others about shared responsibility for their common home. "I cannot promise to be a perfect king," Charles continued, "but I can promise to be a learning king. I promise to listen when you speak, to support when you struggle, and to celebrate when you succeed. I promise that your concerns will be my concerns, your hopes will be my hopes, and your Scotland will be the Scotland I work every day to serve." The congregation was silent, but it wasn't the polite silence of formal occasions. It was the focused attention of people hearing something they hadn't expected, authenticity from someone they had assumed would speak only in ceremonial abstractions. Today, you're not just witnessing a royal ceremony. You're accepting a new member into your community, someone who asks nothing more than the opportunity to prove himself worthy of your trust through his actions, not his title. When Charles finished speaking, the silence continued for a long moment before applause began. Not the polite, measured response typical of royal occasions, but spontaneous appreciation that seemed to surprise even those who were clapping. The ceremony continued with the presentation of the honors of Scotland, the ancient crown jewels that symbolize Scottish sovereignty. But Charles had requested a significant modification to this traditional element. Instead of the honors being presented to him as symbols of his authority over Scotland, they were presented as symbols of his responsibility to Scotland. The Earl of Errol, hereditary Lord High Constable of Scotland, carried the crown of Scotland forward. As he placed it briefly on Charles's head, his words departed from centuries of tradition. "Receive this crown not as a symbol of power over the Scottish people, but as a reminder of your duty to serve them." The moment was both ancient and revolutionary. The physical symbols remained the same, but their meaning had been transformed. This wasn't about divine right or inherited authority. It was about chosen responsibility and earned trust. In the congregation, Mary Campbell from Glasgow found herself unexpectedly moved. She had come to Edinburgh more out of curiosity than respect. But something about this ceremony was reaching her in ways she hadn't anticipated. This didn't feel like watching someone claim power. It felt like witnessing someone accept responsibility. Her sister Jean, the retired teacher, was equally affected but for different reasons. In 40 years of education, she had learned to recognize authentic commitment to service versus performative gestures. What she was seeing from Charles felt genuine. The words of someone who had genuinely wrestled with what his role should mean rather than simply accepting what it had traditionally meant. The service concluded with the entire congregation participating in a responsive reading that Charles had specifically requested. The words spoke of mutual responsibility, shared commitment, and the understanding that a nation's strength came not from its leaders, but from its people working together toward common goals. As the final hymn began, "Flower of Scotland," sung in both English and Gaelic, something remarkable happened. The formal divisions between royalty, clergy, dignitaries, and citizens seemed to dissolve. Everyone in the cathedral was simply Scottish, united in song and purpose. Charles joined the singing with visible emotion, his voice blending with hundreds of others in words that celebrated Scottish resilience, independence of spirit, and love of homeland. For the first time since becoming king, he felt like he belonged exactly where he was. As the service concluded and Charles prepared to leave the cathedral, he carried with him more than the formal recognition of his role as king in Scotland. He carried the beginning of a genuine relationship with the Scottish people, one based not on inherited privilege, but on mutual respect and shared commitment to Scotland's future. As Charles emerged from St. Giles Cathedral, the afternoon light had shifted, casting Edinburgh's ancient architecture in warm golden tones. The crowd that awaited him had grown substantially during the ceremony, with people continuing to arrive from across Scotland to witness this historic moment. But the atmosphere felt different from the morning's formal anticipation. Something had changed during the service. Word had spread about the unscheduled visit to Rosemary House, about the tone of the ceremony, about a king who seemed genuinely committed to serving rather than ruling. The planned route from the cathedral to the Scottish Parliament building would take Charles through the heart of Edinburgh's Old Town, past landmarks that had witnessed centuries of Scottish political and cultural life. This wasn't just a ceremonial procession. It was a journey through Scotland's story, from medieval religious center to modern democratic institution. Walking beside Charles was Nicola Sturgeon, Scotland's first minister, representing the complex relationship between Scottish self-governance and the broader United Kingdom. The two had met several times since Charles became king, and their conversations have been marked by mutual respect despite their different perspectives on Scottish independence. Today, they walk together as representatives of different aspects of Scottish leadership, but with shared commitment to Scottish prosperity and well-being. "Your Majesty," Sturgeon said quietly as they walked. "That was quite a different ceremony from what I expected." Charles glanced at her with a slight smile. "I hope different in a good way. I've learned that Scotland requires authentic engagement, not ceremonial gestures." The crowds lining the Royal Mile responded with enthusiasm that seemed genuinely spontaneous. Children waved from their parents' shoulders, elderly residents called out greetings, and teenagers recorded the moment on their phones while also cheering. But what struck observers most was the relaxed atmosphere. This felt more like a community celebration than a formal state occasion. Among the crowd was David McPherson, a young father from Stirling who had brought his 7-year-old daughter Emma to Edinburgh specifically for this ceremony. David had been somewhat ambivalent about the monarchy throughout his adult life, viewing it as an expensive anachronism. But something about Charles's approach to kingship had intrigued him enough to make the journey. "Dad, why is everyone so happy?" Emma asked, watching the smiling faces around them. "I think they're happy because the king seems to actually care about Scotland," David replied, surprising himself with his answer. A year ago, he wouldn't have imagined saying anything positive about royal involvement in Scottish affairs. Emma considered this seriously. "Is that unusual for kings?" Her question made David laugh, but it also made him think. "You know, sweetheart, I think it might be." Further along the route, outside the Museum of Scotland, a group of university students had gathered with a carefully constructed banner reading, "Welcome home, King Charles." The message was significant. Not "Welcome to Scotland," as if he were visiting a foreign country within his realm, but "Welcome home," as if he belonged there. Sarah Mackenzie, a third-year student at Edinburgh University studying Scottish history, had organized her classmates to attend the ceremony. Initially, it had been more of an academic exercise, witnessing a historical moment for future reference. But as the day progressed, she found herself genuinely moved by what she was observing. "I expected to see the monarchy performing Scotland," she explained to a classmate. "Instead, I'm seeing someone who seems to understand Scotland. There's a massive difference." Her classmate, James Robertson, from Aberdeen, nodded thoughtfully. "My gran always said Charles was different. She met him when he visited the fishing communities up north in the 80s. Said he asked real questions and remembered the answers when he came back years later." As the procession moved past the Scottish Parliament building, Charles paused to acknowledge the institution that represented modern Scottish democracy. The symbolism was deliberate, the ancient crown recognizing and respecting contemporary Scottish self-governance. This wasn't about asserting royal authority over Scottish political institutions. It was about acknowledging the legitimate role of democratic representation within the broader United Kingdom. Inside the Parliament building, members of the Scottish Parliament had gathered to observe the procession from the windows. The sight of their First Minister walking companionably alongside the King, both clearly comfortable in each other's presence, sent its own message about the possibility of respectful collaboration despite political differences. Presiding Officer Alison Johnstone watched from her office window as Charles stopped to greet a group of children from a local primary school who had been brought to witness the historic day. What struck her was his natural ease with the children. He knelt to their level, listened to their excited chatter, and responded with genuine amusement to their innocent questions. "That's not performance," she murmured to her aide. "That's someone who actually enjoys talking with people." The conversation between Charles and the children was indeed unrehearsed and unscripted. 9-year-old Hamish MacLeod from Leith had asked Charles if being king was scary, and Charles had answered with surprising honesty. "Sometimes it is scary," he admitted to the boy. "It's a big responsibility, and I want to do it well. But having the chance to meet people like you reminds me why it's worth doing." 10-year-old Islam Murray from the Canongate had asked Charles what he liked best about Scotland, and his answer revealed the depth of his connection to the country. "I love that Scotland teaches you to earn respect rather than expect it," Charles replied. "Scottish people are kind and welcoming, but they're also honest. If you're not doing a good job, they'll let you know. That helps me be better at my job." The children's teacher, Mrs. Patricia Gordon, watched this interaction with professional interest. In 30 years of teaching, she had developed a keen sense for adults who genuinely connected with children versus those who performed for them. Charles was clearly in the former category. His responses were thoughtful, age-appropriate, and completely authentic. As the procession continued toward Holyrood House Palace, where a reception was planned for community leaders from across Scotland, Charles reflected on how different this day felt from his expectations. He had prepared for formal ceremonies, political complexities, and the challenge of representing the crown in a nation with complicated feelings about monarchy. Instead, he had found genuine connection, authentic conversation, and the beginning of relationships that felt personally meaningful rather than merely ceremonial. The afternoon reception at Holyrood House brought together an extraordinary cross-section of Scottish society. Highlands crofters mingled with Edinburgh professors. Orkney artists shared conversations with Glasgow social workers. Aberdeen fishing industry representatives discussed sustainability with environmental activists from the borders. Charles had specifically requested this diversity, wanted to understand the full spectrum of Scottish experience rather than just meeting with traditional establishment figures. Among the guests was Reverend Dr. Susan MacLeod, minister of a small parish in the Western Isles, who had been chosen to represent rural religious communities. She had been somewhat apprehensive about attending, feeling that her small congregation and remote location made her an unlikely choice for a royal reception. But Charles sought her out specifically, asking detailed questions about the challenges facing island communities and listening intently to her descriptions of how climate change was affecting traditional ways of life. "Your Majesty seems to understand that Scotland isn't just Edinburgh and Glasgow," she later told her husband over the phone. He asked about young people leaving the islands, about elderly residents who need care, about preserving Gaelic culture. "These aren't tourist board questions. These are the real issues we face every day." Charles's conversations throughout the reception revealed the extensive preparation he had done, not just for this ceremony, but for his role as king in Scotland more generally. He spoke knowledgeably with renewable energy engineers about Scotland's wind power potential, discussed agricultural challenges with Highland farmers, and showed genuine understanding of the cultural preservation work being done in various Scottish communities. Dr. Fiona Mackenzie from the University of the Highlands and Islands found herself in an extended conversation with Charles about the unique challenges and opportunities facing Scotland's educational institutions. His questions suggested someone who had spent considerable time thinking about how universities could better serve their communities rather than just pursue academic prestige. "The conversation I had with His Majesty today was more substantive than many meetings I have with education ministers," Dr. Mackenzie later reflected. He understood the connection between higher education and community development, especially in rural areas. That level of engagement suggests someone who sees education as community infrastructure, not just individual opportunity. As the reception continued into the early evening, Charles made a point of speaking with representatives from Scotland's immigrant communities. Ahmed Hassan, who had come to Scotland from Somalia 15 years earlier and now ran a successful restaurant in Glasgow, found himself discussing the ways that new Scots were contributing to Scottish culture while also learning from established traditions. "Your Majesty asked about my children's experience in Scottish schools, about whether they felt welcomed and included," Ahmed later told his wife. "But he also asked what Somalia had taught me that might benefit Scotland. He seemed genuinely interested in what newcomers bring to the country, not just how well they adapt to what's already here. The day's events concluded with an informal gathering in Holyrood House courtyard, where Charles had requested the opportunity to thank everyone who had contributed to the day's success. As he spoke to the assembled group, security officers, cathedral staff, community organizers, and participants from the various events, his words carried the weariness of a long day, but also the energy of someone who had found genuine purpose. "Today has reminded me why I wanted to serve Scotland," he said simply. "Not because of its history, though that's magnificent. Not because of its traditions, though those matter deeply. But because of its people, your warmth, your honesty, your commitment to each other, and to making Scotland a better place for everyone who calls it home." As the evening light faded over Edinburgh's ancient skyline, Charles stood at a window in Holyrood House, looking out over the city where he had just experienced one of the most meaningful days of his reign. Scotland had welcomed him not just as king, but as someone ready to earn his place in the Scottish community through service, understanding, and genuine commitment to Scottish well-being. The formal ceremony was over, but Charles understood that the real work was just beginning. Today had established the foundation for a different kind of relationship between the Crown and Scotland, one based on partnership rather than authority, on mutual respect rather than inherited privilege. Scotland had shown him what was possible. Now he had the opportunity to prove himself worthy of their trust. 3 months after the historic ceremony in Edinburgh, the true measure of Charles's commitment to Scotland was being tested not in grand cathedrals or formal receptions, but in the quiet, persistent work of understanding and serving Scottish communities. The king had established a pattern of monthly visits to different regions of Scotland, each one carefully planned not for ceremonial impact, but for genuine engagement with local challenges and opportunities. On a crisp November morning, Charles found himself in the small fishing village of Pittenweem on Scotland's east coast, following up on conversations from his Edinburgh reception about the challenges facing traditional coastal communities. The visit had been requested not by local officials seeking royal attention, but by Charles himself, who had been corresponding with local fishing families about the impact of climate change, Brexit regulations, and economic pressures on their way of life. Willie MacLeod, a fourth-generation fisherman whose great-grandfather had worked these same waters, had initially been skeptical when told the king wanted to visit their community. Royal visits to fishing villages typically involve carefully choreographed walks past neat boats and staged conversations with selected locals. But this visit felt different from the moment Charles arrived at the harbor at dawn to join the morning's fishing expedition. "Your Majesty," Willie had said, somewhat awkwardly, "the boat's not exactly fitted out for royal passengers." "Good," Charles had replied with a smile, pulling on the weatherproof gear that had been provided. "I'm not here as a royal passenger. I'm here to understand your work." The 3 hours Charles spent on the fishing boat that morning provided him with insights that no briefing document could have conveyed. He experienced firsthand the skill required to work with nets in rough seas, the uncertainty that came with depending on marine ecosystems for survival, and the deep knowledge of weather, tides, and fish behavior that had been passed down through generations. More importantly, he listened as Willie and his crew talked about their real concerns. The regulations that sounded reasonable in Brussels or London became complicated and sometimes contradictory when applied to the practical realities of small boat fishing. Climate change wasn't an abstract policy issue, but a daily reality that affected where fish could be found and when it was safe to go to sea. "The water temperatures changed in the last decade," explained Jamie Ross, Willie's nephew and the boat's engineer. "Fish we used to catch regularly have moved north. New species are showing up that weren't here when I was learning the trade. We're adapting, but it's challenging when the regulations haven't caught up with the changes." Charles asked detailed questions that revealed he had done considerable research before this visit. He understood the economic pressures facing fishing communities, the complications introduced by new trade relationships, and the environmental concerns that affected long-term sustainability. But more than that, he seemed to grasp the cultural significance of fishing communities in Scottish identity. This isn't just about economics. Charles observed as they returned to harbor. These communities maintain knowledge and traditions that are part of Scotland's heritage. When fishing villages struggle, Scotland loses something irreplaceable. The conversation continued on shore, where Charles met with other fishing families, boat builders, net makers, and the various businesses that supported the local fishing industry. But he also spoke with school children about their plans for the future, with elderly residents about the changes they had witnessed, and with young families about the challenges of maintaining traditional ways of life in a rapidly changing world. Mary Mackenzie, who ran the village's small post office and general store, found herself in an extended conversation with Charles about the role small businesses played in maintaining community cohesion. Her shop served as an informal community center where residents gathered for news, gossip, and mutual support. But, like many rural businesses, it faced pressures from online shopping, changing demographics, and economic uncertainty. Your Majesty asked questions that showed he understood how everything connects, Mary later told her husband. The fishing industry supports the shop. The shop serves as a community hub. The community maintains the traditions that make this place special. He sees the whole ecosystem, not just individual parts. Charles's visit to Pittenweem was followed by similar engagements across Scotland. A weekend in the Shetland Islands learning about renewable energy projects, several days in the Scottish borders understanding hill farming challenges, and time in Glasgow's East End working with community organizations addressing urban poverty and social exclusion. Each visit followed the same pattern: extensive preparation through correspondence with local residents, genuine engagement with real work and real challenges, and follow-up action that demonstrated the visits were more than ceremonial. Charles had begun using his position to highlight Scottish innovations, connect communities with resources, and advocate for Scottish interests in national policy discussions. The impact of this approach became clear during Charles's visit to the town of Forres in Moray, where he had come to learn about a community-led renewable energy project. The local wind farm was entirely owned by residents and provided both clean energy and economic benefits that remained within the community rather than flowing to distant shareholders. Dr. Sarah McPherson, who had led the development of the community energy project, expected a polite royal visit with photo opportunities and vague expressions of support. Instead, she found herself in a detailed technical discussion about energy storage, grid connection challenges, and the policy frameworks needed to support community ownership of renewable energy infrastructure. His Majesty understood the technical challenges we face, Dr. McPherson later explained to her colleagues. But he also grasped the social and economic implications. When he asked about replicating our model in other communities, his question showed he had been thinking about this systematically, not just showing polite interest. Charles's engagement with Scottish communities was beginning to have practical results. His correspondence with fishing communities had led to meetings with government ministers about regulatory reform. His visits to renewable energy projects had resulted in new policy initiatives supporting community ownership. His time with educational institutions had contributed to increased funding for programs serving rural and remote communities. But perhaps more significantly, Charles's approach was changing how Scots thought about the monarchy's role in their society. Traditional royal visits had often felt like performances designed to demonstrate royal grandeur or generate positive publicity. These new engagements felt like genuine partnerships between the Crown and Scottish communities working together to address shared challenges. This shift in perception became evident during Charles's visit to Edinburgh's Grassmarket area, where he spent time with organizations working to address homelessness and substance abuse. Instead of the carefully managed visits typical of such sensitive locations, Charles spent hours in direct conversation with people experiencing homelessness, learning about the complex factors that had led to their situations and the barriers they faced in accessing support. Tom Henderson, who had been homeless for 8 months after losing his job and subsequently his housing, found himself in conversation with the king about the practical realities of life on Edinburgh streets. The conversation wasn't comfortable or easy, but it was honest. Your Majesty asked me what I needed most, Tom later recalled. Not what services were available or what programs existed, but what would actually help me get back on my feet. That's a different question than most people ask. Charles's response to these conversations wasn't to offer quick solutions or make unrealistic promises. Instead, he worked with local organizations to understand how existing programs could be improved and how policy barriers could be addressed. His involvement helped secure additional funding for emergency accommodation and led to new initiatives connecting homeless individuals with employment opportunities. The transformation in Charles's relationship with Scotland became most visible during his visit to the Highland Games in Braemar, an event he had attended many times as Prince of Wales. Previously, his presence had been largely ceremonial, watching events, presenting prizes, and making brief appearances. This time, he participated more fully in the community aspects of the gathering. Charles spent time with Highland athletes learning about the traditional sports, their cultural significance, and the dedication required to maintain these ancient competitions. He visited with craftspeople demonstrating traditional skills, discussed Highland music with pipe bands, and engaged in lengthy conversations with clan representatives about preserving Gaelic culture and language. Most remarkably, when invited to try his hand at tossing the cobber, a traditional Highland athletic event involving throwing a large wooden pole, Charles accepted. The attempt was neither graceful nor particularly successful, but his willingness to participate rather than simply observe sent a powerful message about his commitment to engaging with Scottish culture on its own terms. That was the moment I realized he had truly become our king, observed Hamish MacLeod, a local clan chief who had initially been skeptical about Charles's commitment to Scottish traditions. Anyone can watch the games and make polite comments. Participating means you're willing to risk looking foolish in order to show respect for what matters to us. As winter settled over Scotland, Charles established what would become a cherished tradition. Monthly letters to Scottish communities he had visited, updating them on progress made on issues they had discussed, and sharing news of how their insights had influenced his work elsewhere in Scotland. The letters weren't formal royal communications, but personal correspondence that maintained the relationships he had begun building through his visits. Agnes MacLeod, the elderly resident of Rosemary House whom Charles had visited on the morning of his Edinburgh ceremony, continued their correspondence throughout the autumn months. Her journal, the gift Charles had given her, had filled with observations about Scottish society, reflections on the changes she had witnessed, and insights about community life that Charles found invaluable. "Your Majesty," she wrote in one letter, "you asked me once what makes a good king. I've been thinking about that question for months now. I believe a good king is someone who makes his people feel seen, heard, and valued. Not because of what they can do for him, but because of who they are as human beings. You're becoming that kind of king." The year's end brought reflection on what had changed since that historic July morning in Edinburgh. Charles had not solved Scotland's challenges or eliminated the complexities of the relationship between Scotland and the Crown. But he had established something perhaps more valuable: trust based on genuine engagement, respect earned through consistent action, and partnerships built on shared commitment to Scottish well-being. The final measure of his transformation came during Hogmanay celebrations in Edinburgh, where Charles chose to spend New Year's Eve not at formal receptions or private gatherings, but in the streets with ordinary Scots celebrating the arrival of 2024. As midnight approached and the crowd began the traditional countdown, Charles found himself surrounded by people who had come to see him not as a distant royal figure, but as someone who genuinely belonged to their Scottish community. When the clock struck 12 and the crowd erupted in celebration, Charles joined in singing Auld Lang Syne, with thousands of voices united in one of Scotland's most cherished traditions. As he stood there, arm in arm with strangers who had become neighbors, he understood that he had found something he had been searching for throughout his long journey to the throne: a sense of belonging, purpose, and genuine connection to the people he served. Scotland had indeed welcomed Charles III as king, but more than that, Scotland had helped him discover what kind of king he was meant to be. In return, Charles had given Scotland something it had rarely received from the crown, a monarch who saw his role not as ruling over Scotland, but as serving within the Scottish community as one of its own. The historic ceremony in St. Giles Cathedral had been just the beginning. The real coronation had happened gradually through hundreds of conversations, dozens of visits, and countless moments of genuine human connection. Charles had been crowned not with ancient symbols of authority, but with the trust and respect of the Scottish people he had committed to serve.